Hey addicts, welcome back to another addicted fishing video. I'm Nick Popov, and today we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of jig fishing for salmon, trout, and steelhead. So if you like jig fishing for salmon, trout, and steelhead and want to learn more about it, stay tuned. It's coming up right now. All right guys, so we're gonna start with the rod and the reel. I'm not gonna go too in depth on the rod and the reel because we have lots of videos that we can put in the link in the description that will go over the type of the rod and reel that we're gonna use for this application. This is gonna be more about what you're gonna use, what type of jig, what color of jig, and the setup itself. So let's dive in. So first things first, you're gonna need a float for float fishing for jig or with a jig. So I'm gonna grab my Mustad float. These floats work great in low water conditions because they're super stealthy. They're very small. There's not a lot of splash when they land, and they're super easy to mend in a low water scenario. So I'm fishing low water. You know, you may do different things for different water conditions, and we will talk a little bit more about that. So first, with these addicted floats, they come with a few different pieces. They come with a couple of weights, and they come with 2 pieces of rubber tubing. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna slide this rubber tubing on first, and then there's a little hole here in this bobber, and I'm gonna go ahead and slide my line through this little hole, and I'm going to put my other piece of rubber tubing on. Okay, and then next there's a weight system, and this is gonna vary for where you're fishing and how heavy a jig you're fishing. Right now I'm gonna be fishing pretty light jig because of the current conditions being such low water. So I'm gonna use both the weights in this. Now, if you're ever in a scenario where you need to use a 1/4 ounce jig, you may wanna remove one of the weights. They just come, these 2 little gold weights here, and all you're gonna do is just slide these weights up onto your bobber like so. And then it comes with a little plastic grommet, and you're going to slide that grommet up and on. So now I take my first piece of tubing, and I like to get it wet here on the stem. So I just get it a little bit wet, and I slide it right over the tip there with the first piece of rubber tubing. So this is gonna allow you to set the depth at whatever you want the depth to be. So this float is super nice because you can use it as a fixed float, but it's also sliding, so you're not just set to one depth. You can change your depths. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna wet the stem again, and I'm gonna slide my second piece of rubber tubing on there. So as you can see, you have your top piece of tubing, your 2 weights, your little grommet to hold those weights on, and then your second piece of tubing. Now, is what that little grommet does, that little rubber grommet, is if you were to break off or this tubing breaks, you don't lose the weights on your float, so you're able to save your float and your weight. So it's kind of a cool little setup. You break off, you still get your weights back, and all you need to do is replace a piece of tubing. So next I'm gonna slide that up just a little bit. And I also like to kind of wet my line too when I slide that up, because if you put these, if that rubber is real dry, these 2 rubber pieces are real dry, sometimes it will kind of fray your line up a little bit. So get that a little bit wet, slide that up your line. Next, we're gonna go to the meat and potatoes of the jig fishing, right? So sometimes jig fishing can be overwhelming. There's so many different colors, so many different sizes, and you look at it and you just go, you know, I guess I'll pick this one. Well, there is a little bit of, you know, theory behind what you want to use and what conditions. So today, like I said, we're fishing low clear water, and as you can see, there's many different colors here. We got bright oranges, bright pinks, a little bit of red and white. This is one of the, you know, people's favorites, the nightmare pattern. There's lots of different jigs, lots of different styles, and lots of different weights. So don't overcomplicate things. In low clear water, it's real important that you look at your scenario. You know, you have super clear water, you know, you have a small creek or a small stream. You're not going to want to throw this big giant gaudy jig. You're going to want to dumb it down to something that's a little more dull, maybe smaller in presentation, a smaller weight. So for me, we have you know, jigs range from a 32nd ounce all the way up to a 1/4 ounce and even a 1/2 ounce in some jigs. So for this scenario, I'm gonna pick one of the smaller jigs, probably like a 16th ounce or maybe an 1/8 ounce. And in low water is what I like to do is I like to look at my, you know, look at the river that I'm fishing. As you can see, it's pretty small little stream here. And you got a little bit of flow, but it's very, very clear. So I'm probably not going to pick one of these bright oranges or one of these extremely, extremely fluorescent pinks. I'm gonna go for something a little more subtle. Now I'm always gonna start with something subtle and then work my way up to something a little more drastic. So for this specific scenario, I'm gonna start with a black head versus a white head. And I'm gonna go with a little bit of black fur and some red. And the reason behind that is I wanna start out with something that's not gonna hit the water and just be big and bold. I'm gonna give these fish a chance to come to it and eat it on their own, instead of putting something in their face that's gonna scare them right out of the gate. So there it is. We got our jig tied on, and then we got our addicted float. It's super simple, guys. This is one of the most, probably one of the easiest beginner things, you know, if you're starting out steelhead fishing or just getting into steelhead fishing, this is an outstanding way to start because it's pretty simple. There's not a lot of technique. You just got to get it out there and keep this bobber floating upright, and when it goes under, you set the hook. So I'm gonna start out with this jig. I'm gonna make a few casts and kind of show you guys how I would work this jig through this certain hole. So come along with me, and we're gonna go try to see what we can do. There he is! Oh! Double!
What a nice fish. Look at that.
They've got it! Carrying him into the old landing pad.
Well, we'll go backwards.
What a pretty little fish.
Not so proud, man.
Oh my gosh!
Got him.
All right, guys. So I'm gonna kind of show you how I would fish a jig in this run from top to bottom. So I'm gonna kind of show you the run first and what I'm looking at, and then I'm gonna show you how I would break it down. So you're always gonna have the head of the run up here, okay? So this is gonna be your headwater where the fastest moving water is. Sometimes you'll have a little eddy running on the inside here. That's always where I'm gonna start. You know, a jig can be fished in anything, you know, fast to slow. I mean, it could go from water that's virtually not moving to fishing the inside of some extremely fast water like this. So first of all is what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look at this water and I'm gonna look at the line I'm gonna fish. I'm gonna start up here in this faster water, and as you can see in this fast water, there's some slower water to the inside. For me, that's ideal jig water. You know, the jig is gonna fish its best where there's some sort of walking paced water where it's gonna move your jig downstream at a slower pace instead of just ripping your jig downriver. You don't want it moving too fast. You want it walking pace with the pace of the river. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a guess at how deep it is. So I'm guessing it's probably 4 to 6 feet, you know, in there. So I'm gonna set my float, get it a little bit wet, and I'm gonna set my float at about 5 feet. And then I'm gonna come over here, I'm gonna try to stay off of the water. Whether you're fishing for salmon, trout, or steelhead in low water conditions, the last thing you wanna do is walk right to the river's edge, cast your line, stand right on the edge of the river and cast right on top of the fish. These fish can be laying right on the edge of the river. So last thing I'm gonna do is walk to the water. I got a rod and I can cast it for a reason. So I'm gonna stay back off the water just a little bit, and I'm gonna try to start up here and then work my way down through the rest. There's about 3 different sections of water I can fish in here, but I'm gonna start up in this deeper stuff here. So I'm gonna make my cast. I'm gonna pull it into that slower water there. And this is where the braided line is so important. So the braided line is gonna float. If you have a monofilament line that is just laying on top of this water, the mono is gonna suck your bobber and it's not gonna float. It's gonna get sucked underwater and almost sink and grab a lot of water. With the braided line, you are able to keep your line floating on the surface and mend. If you watch, I'll lay the line on the water and then I'll mend my line. And as you can see, it didn't affect my bobber. I'm just lightly mending and keeping tight to my bobber, allowing my bobber to float through that run. So I'm gonna let this run down into this deeper little boil here. And I'm gonna reel up and do it again. So as you can see, that time I went through there and I wasn't tapping bottom. So I'm gonna get it a little bit deeper. These fish tend to run in the bottom third of the river, so, or the bottom, you know, foot or two of the river. So I want my jig 6 inches off the bottom. So I didn't touch bottom that time, so I'm gonna go 6 inches deeper and do the same exact cast. Here we go. And now if I drag this time, I know that I was at the right depth. And as you can see, I'm dragging. So I'll reel that in and I'm gonna go right back to what I was because that was about the right depth. And the cool thing about summer steelhead and salmon and trout, for instance, is these fish are gonna come up and grab stuff. So it doesn't necessarily have to be right in front of their face for them to eat it. But if you have a more lethargic fish or a fish that, you know, is just kind of holding and versus moving, you might need to put it right in front of their face. So don't be afraid to adjust that. You know, try it shallower, try it deeper. But what I'm shooting for is the bottom foot of the river. So this is how I would, I kind of thought that was gonna go down for a second. So once I've made a few casts through there, this is where the jig colors come into play. So once I've made a few casts through here with something a little bit less intrusive, before I leave this hole, I'm gonna throw something in there that is very, very bright and gaudy and try to make one mad, because just because you don't get bit on this color does not mean you're not gonna get a bit on a bright pink or a chartreuse or something that's a little more vibrant. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna walk down, I'm gonna fish this through the next little section here, which is a little bit faster moving, a little bit shallower water, but I'm gonna fish it just like I did in that, keeping it moving freely throughout there without pulling on it or moving it out of the zone. I'm trying to keep it fishing without letting a bunch of line on the water, and I'll show you how I'm gonna do that in this faster current. This is where the mending and the braided line comes in more. So I'm gonna come over here. As you can see now, we've moved down about 20 feet. Now, there's a big boulder out here, and fish love structure. So these fish will sit behind this boulder, on the edge of this boulder. So what I'm gonna try to do is I'm gonna try to start it up above the boulder and let it run down through the tail out. Now it's a little bit deeper up in the top of the hole, but as it gets down into the tail out, it's gonna get shallower and shallower. So I'm gonna fish this just a little bit shallower than I would in the upper section of the hole. And I'm gonna try to run it all the way down this tail out. So I'm just gonna flip it out there, get it in that current. Now here's where mending your line is so important. So I'm trying to get it to go right by that rock. As you can see, I'm just letting my line sit off the water there. Okay, so we didn't get bit that time, so now I'm gonna move it out another 2 to 3 feet. And I'm just trying to cover every lane there is on this little section here, because you don't know if the fish are gonna be in the middle, on the edge, right on the bank next to you. So you just gotta make sure you cover all sections. So it doesn't look like I'm hitting bottom. So once again, I'm just gonna go in here. I'm gonna slide my bobber stop up about 6 inches. And I'm gonna do this again. Now you see how that line's sitting on the water. I'm just gonna lift my rod tip up and mend that line, still allowing the bobber and jig to float freely down the river. The most important thing about jig fishing, when you're actually fishing the jig itself, especially with a fixed style float like this, is that when you mend your line, a lot of guys, the biggest thing I see people do, and I'll show you right here, but they go to mend their line and they pull their bobber. They're always pulling their bobber. And what that's doing is it's just pulling you out of the hole. So you want to try to, when you're mending, you want to do your best to mend very lightly without moving the bobber at all. I don't want my bobber to move at all when I'm mending. And then once the bobber gets below me, I'm letting line off of the reel, still allowing that bobber to float freely. And this is the fun part about jig fishing. So this color didn't work. So we're gonna go back over to our box and we are going to grab something a little bit more intrusive. So something that's gonna be a little bit, give it a little more flair, a little more color, something that they could see it from a little further away. The other thing too is we were fishing, you know, when we first got here, we were fishing with sunlight on the water, and that can change things. I like blacks, and if there's sunlight on the water, I'm gonna go with something black and white, you know, something that's very, you know, bug looking versus something that's looks like it's not from the river, like an orange or something like that. But now that we're getting some shade and some cover on the river and the sun's starting to set, I'm gonna go with something a little bit brighter, and I think I will go with an orange and white. So I'm gonna do something like this. So these are our little Sink It series here. They come in all different colors. This is one of my favorites. All right, guys, there is my selection. I don't know what it is about steelhead and orange, but they love it. Here's another cool little tip for you when you're jig fishing. This is one of those things that's talked about a lot, and there's a lot of different opinions and a lot of different, you know, one guy says do this, one guy says do that, but when you tie your jig on, there's two different positions this jig can sit in. And one is your knot could be up on the top of the jig, okay? So you have your knot sitting up on the top. And then the other is you can slide this jig down, and this is how most jig fishermen fish their jigs. They fish it with that knot sitting right off the top of the eye like that. And the idea behind that is that jig is floating downriver just like this, you know, coming down at a fish like this through the current, versus being like this vertical. So myself, I do a little bit of both, and this is something that a lot of people probably don't do, but when fishing's tough and I know there's fish around, I will switch that to a vertical position to where, straight up and down position, to when fishing's tough and I know there's fish in there, I'll make that jig run like this. And believe it or not, sometimes that makes a big difference. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. We're gonna make a few casts through here and see if we can't stick one, because I know there's some fish laying around in here. But this time I'm gonna work down in this lower section. I'm gonna even get lower, because we put 5 or 6 casts through this little upper section and it doesn't look like there was anything in there that wanted to play. So I'm gonna get it over on the far side of the river, and I'm just gonna slowly let my line down. And now see how my line's out in front of my bobber? I'm gonna mend that line so my bobber's running straight up and down. I'm gonna let it run all the way through the tail out. Now, another cool thing that you can do, which on this river system we can't, but don't be afraid to add bait to these jigs, okay? Just because a jig comes in a package like this, and don't be afraid to put bait on it. Put shrimp on it, put a shrimp tail. You know, guys use little anise eggs. There's lots of different stuff, and scent, you know. Don't add scent to the head, to the hair on the jig. I would add your scent up around the head and on the bead. You know, put some Procure gel on there, and usually that will account for another bite or two throughout the day. All right, guys, so hopefully this helps you become a better salmon, trout, steelhead fisherman with a jig. You guys, if you like these videos and you like what you see, make sure you go down there and hit the thumbs up, tap the subscribe button, and we'll see you on the water.